my name is Christine Wise, and I am here to present to you today a presentation about FERPA and how we can protect our tigers for Loveland City School District. So first, what is FERPA? FERPA is the Family Educational Rights and Privacy Act, and it is a federal law that protects the confidentiality of student education records. And it also prevents schools from sharing any student data without parental consent, or should a student be above the age of 18, then they would also need to provide their consent to share data. FERPA is a federal privacy law that gives parents protection and access to educational records and transcripts. There are a few different laws that are protecting student privacy. So FERPA being the first, which we just talked about, and FERPA was established in 1974. The next being PPRA, which is the Protection of Pupils' Rights Amendment, which was then created in 1978. You have No Child Left Behind in 2001, and then the Privacy Act of 1974. Next, it's important to look at the different kinds of student records and where we might be considering if they are covered under FERPA. So there are two different kinds of records that I found from my research. First being educational records. So that would include grades, immunizations, any disciplinary reports, testing, GPA, and attendance records. The other being directory records. Directory records refers to student name, address, phone number, grade level, birthday, and any degrees and awards received. So the records that are covered under FERPA are the educational records. FERPA in the classroom. So it's really important for teachers and staff to have a good understanding of FERPA and how it affects our students and our classroom. So first, it prevents sharing data without parental consent, or like we discussed before, student consent for any students over the age of 18. It also permits the sharing of info in certain situations. So should there be a judicial order for that information, then schools are expected to comply. Or should there be a health or safety emergency, in that case, then schools are permitted to share information. It's really important for teachers and staff to consider third-party vendors. So when we're using other apps or different resources, we need to have a good understanding of if they comply to FERPA as well. We also need to have approval from our school district to use those apps or resources in our classroom. And so a big one is just to be really, really careful of free apps, and that just to know that they are collecting student information and sometimes end up selling that student data and information. So that's why we need approval for everything we use in the classroom. Next, for teachers or administrators, this is really important to know and understand that teachers can share observations of situations, administrators as well, but what we cannot share is specific information from educational records. Another big one for our current 21st century is social media, and just being really mindful of the information that we're sharing on social media and that we are not violating any FERPA laws. And then also important to shred old student records and make sure that you do that in an appropriate manner and choose the right path for destroying records. A lot of schools now also have school resource officers, and so staff need to understand what information we can share with the school resource officer. So if they are deemed a school official, so that would mean hired by the school, and if their interest in student data or information is from an educational interest, then you can share that information with the school resource officer. Destruction of student information. There's 3 ways you can do that. So the first being to clear it, and that just means resetting back to the factory state, purging it. The next means of destruction is to purge, And what that means is that any data cannot be recovered. And then the final way is to destroy. And so teachers and staff are responsible for understanding which measure they should take in order to destroy student data and information. And that should just be based on what that information is. So tips for parents. So part of our job as educators is to inform and teach our parents how to protect themselves and their students. So first tip for parents, monitor and limit the use of student info they're giving out. Second, make sure they read all school information that comes home. Third, being to ask questions. Always ask the why and why this information is needed. Next, define the directory information specific to your school. And then following that is just requesting third-party vendor information, because that'll allow a better understanding of how they're using your students' information and if there's any potential of them sharing it, and also if they follow FERPA guidelines. And then also finally consider any surveys and questionnaires and if they're truly necessary for your student to participate in. So the 21st century has changed a great deal of things for all of us and in our classrooms, but it's also changed just how we are tracking student information. And so we've moved away from just basic paper files, and now records are mostly used digitally. So it's important that FERPA adjusts and becomes more in touch with the current day and age that we're in. So every day, students, because they're on different resources, apps, platforms in the classroom, through technology, every day they are creating some electronic data. So in recent years, since 2013, 40 states have created 120 new laws addressing privacy for students. Next, looking at security cameras. So security cameras in schools, there are about 80% of public schools that do use security cameras. And it's really important under FERPA that schools put cameras in plain view areas and that they are not violating student privacy. So like hallways, buses can have them, but a place where they certainly could not would be like a bathroom or a locker room. They also need to notify and have postings around the building showing that cameras are in use. The Federal Electronic Communications Privacy Act from 1986, what that does is it states that any kind of audio that they would retrieve from video surveillance, it cannot be used unless one party consents to that. FERPA violation. So should there be a violation, the procedure following the violation is that parents and students can file a complaint. And then should it be deemed necessary, they would follow a formal investigation. And so what happens is each case is, there will be determinations just based on that individual case. And it's important that those procedures, they operate efficiently and it does not take too long. And then finally, it's the department's job to be a mediator and help resolve any kind of dispute. And then also moving forward to improve upon a school agency's FERPA standards and guidelines. It's their job to help make any improvements to those guidelines that they have. And ultimately, the department is committed to protecting student privacy. How do we ensure FERPA in Loveland City Schools? So number one, we need to raise awareness. So with staff, with students, and parents. Number two, we need to confirm that FERPA applies to our schools. So we do receive federal funding from the government. So therefore, we are covered under FERPA and it applies to our school. Number three, knowing the rights, protections, and exceptions. So we must be incredibly knowledgeable about FERPA in order to ensure that we are following it. Number four, we need to choose compliant vendors and make sure that those vendors are also following FERPA laws. And then again, be diligent about making sure we get approval of any additional resources or apps we use in our classroom. Number 5, train school staff. So just continued education in that area so that we can be well versed and have a good understanding of FERPA to protect our tigers. Number 6, implement compliant policies and procedures. So not only do we need to understand them, but we actually need to put those into action. Number 7, encrypt emails and files for protection. And number 8, implement other prevention tools. So should we deem it necessary to provide alternate prevention tools, then it is our responsibility to do so. So looking at Loveland City Schools and some of our specific FERPA guidelines and policies, we do authorize the use of video surveillance at schools and on buses. And we do that for a few different reasons. One being to ensure a safe environment for all students and staff. Second being to protect school property. We must place those cameras in common areas that are protecting student privacy. And then any information that we find from that video surveillance, it is to be confidential. The board is responsible for all student records, that PII. It is available to parents, students, and school officials. And the board does define specific directory records. The board does, I'm so sorry, go back. The board does identify and define a school official as a person who is employed by the board, and they must have legitimate educational interest for that student in order for information to be shared with them. And finally, the superintendent will create administrative guidelines, and they will inform parents and students yearly as those change. And these are my references. There's a few there. All right. Thank you so much for listening to my presentation on FERPA and Loveland City Schools.